Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. We are going to be looking at some psychic modulation plugins over a couple of videos here. They reached out and asked me to go through their devices, their main devices, and while I've actually known of PM for a very long time, I'm not really sure how long, I've actually never used them. So it was interesting to have them come over and to get a sense of, well, what are these? Where do they fit? What are they good at? I think part of the reason that I hadn't really paid much attention is because they do spend a bit of their energy, their psychic energy, around kind of romanticizing this strange mid to late 80s VHS thing. And of course the sort of Commodore VIC-20 sort of interfaces just kind of made me think, oh, they're probably not very serious with regards to the way that I approach things. But looking at what they've got here and adjusting for how I would want to use it in more traditional style mixing, and also bearing in mind the clear target audience that they have here, I think they've got a lot going on. In this, I did note they do seem to have a fairly solid and robust user base, despite the fact that they're not a super well-known dev. But I think that's cool, because I think they are doing something that's, while not unique, I think they've got an incredibly good handle on it, far more than not. What we're going to do is actually start with Melt, which is almost a cut down of some of the others, and then we will look at some of the larger devices. This will give us the kind of the beating heart of what they do, leaving us a little bit more free to look at the extra doohickeys that come with more of their mainline devices. It's called Melt. So Melt obviously makes you think, well, what's that going to do? And to be honest, I sort of thought, oh, it's just going to really mess up audio. And to some extent, yes, that's what it does. Let's run through some A/Bs to give you a sense of how this is going to sound. I'm going to turn this off. We will start with this very flat, deliberately very flat synth sound. Europa is wonderful, but without care, it's flat and digital, a bit lifeless. So deliberately started that way. So on and off, I've deliberately gone with a very mild setting. I've set up my own initialized patch. It's meant to give us this sort of tape wow and flutter, and like I said, with a bit of a leaning towards some of the VHS kind of thing. Rather than going through patches which are there, you see I've created my own init patch, we'll use this randomize button. Now we start to see what they mean by melt. My sound is not quite what it used to be. But note the big difference in movement that we get. I've made quite a few videos where I talk about movement, and this is a great way of doing it, but we probably don't always want it to be that much. Normally I would avoid a random button like the plague, I think that they are, but in this situation I felt like more often than not you get something that's kind of cool. It is a sound goodifier, but beyond many, I think it actually does more sound goodifying than anything. Some patches are a little as your father. But they're random, so you get the idea that it's all about this kind of make things wonky. We'll go back to my init patch, which is deliberately designed to be incredibly mild, far milder than their target audience, so to speak. So we've got our piece here. We'll add a little bit of Hertz delay on ascend. bring in this very random drum loop. Apply the same init patch to it. Obviously we won't get quite the same amount of apparent movement, but if you listen closely to the AB, you will hear this deepen and become, well, just warmer. Somewhat more 3D in a sense. So with that very mild initialized patch, we transform from this, which is very flat and sticky taped despite having the send echo, to now having this very nice sort of subtle-ish movement without getting into the drunk lo-fi hipster thing. I like that. That is really, really nice. Of course, we can get into opening them up and pressing random button. Again, I would never encourage doing this. Flat. Mobile. That's where this really wins. Yes, it is aimed at this overdo it, clapped out VHS kind of sound, which is beyond where I want to be, and honestly I get very tired and often switch off things that within a couple of seconds just seem to be more about that sound than anything else. But with care, this is able to be used very, very broadly. So it's a cool device. Psychic modulation. Been around for a little while. I didn't look at exactly how long. Everything in Doorsphere feels like forever, and it turns out to have been 3 years, but I get the feeling they may have been about for a decade or so. Their pricing is very, very reasonable. This is $29 US. For what it does, which we will run through soon, I think that that's really, really well priced because it's a lot deeper, more nuanced, and has more character than many other things that pitch into this arena. So I think that's a really good thing. They are, as I say, a boutique developer, and they have a little bit of a boutique following, which is a cool thing because they're not just another everybody is using exactly the same kind of sound. Of course, if it becomes popular, that might be the case, and so many people are doing the thing that this does. But with care, you can get really, really nice results without being incredibly obvious that you're just doing the, oh look, everybody's drunk lo-fi hipster. In terms of good and bad, and then we will get into the walkthrough. What I think is good is that I do think that this sounds very good. Yes, everything in digital sounds good, but does it feel good? Yes, so long as this is not being overdone, then I think this feels very good. So does it do its job? Yeah, definitely. It is also pretty detailed. As I mentioned before, this fella has more knobs than the average, meaning that either it's just going to be a pain and most of the knobs do nothing, or the knobs each adds a little bit of extra something. This is far more the latter, in that each of these knobs tends to add a little bit more of a something or other, which, so long as you balance them carefully, gives you far more movement than the common devices like this that work on one, maybe two axes. This works on 4, 5, 6 a fair amount of the time, which is actually really nice and far more in keeping with real analog gear. Yes, the downside is that this is very quick to overdo. So if we look here, we'll just pull the drums out. It very quickly becomes messed up. their whole thing is about melting sand, and it does do that. But my biggest negative, my biggest frustration in using it to make beautiful music, bearing in mind that to me melted, chewed up music is not beautiful, is that it just tends to go into chewed up too fast. So if I were to have one single, hey guys, can you do this? You've got this one overall knob that changes. I think it's like a multiply everything that you've set here by 10 or something like that. Is perhaps if you had a little dot next to it, maybe even in the O, that we press this button and this perhaps divides by 10. So then you've still got your main intended target audience of people who want to do this kind of thing. David Hasselhoff on a bender kind of thing. And then people like myself who want the feel that's in here, but not at that point where people start to feel woozy. So we could use the very same knob to say, okay, we'll set the settings, which sound great to start with, and then you realize, yeah, look, that's just really overdone, and turn this up, and it actually pulls it all back. Otherwise, what you've got to do in here is go in here and pull everything down, and as you see, they get a little too broad. The knobs are too quick to go into. They can tend to be a little odd and break convention. It's not as obvious in this, but some things are just a little confusing. And you need to RTFM, which unfortunately is vague and obtuse. I get that they may kind of feel like that they've got some sort of 21 secret herbs and spices thing going on, but the reality is they kind of don't. They don't even necessarily have to tell us what the math is to get there, but just a greater sense of what's this really doing. I know again that a fair amount of their target market is all like, oh, well, we just turn everything to 11 and then it's all like, and that's fair enough. But I also think, why not cater to people like myself who are after this kind of thing at the detail in which you're doing it, but with a lot more subtlety. So it's not as, because that becomes a pain to use and also to understand. Some things are just unusual. Like here, they've got the mod speed separated out from the melt and chorus, when in actual fact the mod speed is what's driving this and this. So just little things like if there were a break in this thing here that's currently saying they're in separate boxes, they're separate from each other, that says, hey, no, these guys are related to each other. The stuff up here is related to itself. You kind of reasonably assume that the signal's going to work through here, but this one works a little differently. Now, that's not at all unusual to have the modulation stuff in the middle. I tend to design it that way as well, but some way to just remind us that this is what controls these. Little tiny things like that are often the difference between what I will loosely call professional workflow and one that might be cool or something, but is just harder to use, especially with an RTFM that is either not read or vague and obtuse, possibly because people either think everybody knows what they're doing or they just go, yeah, no one's going to read it anyway. Don't know. They are the downsides, but overall, it actually feels really good and has a lot of detail. So let's dig in and have a look through this fella. And remember, this is kind of the heart of several of their other devices. They've extracted the melt bit from their other devices. So once we understand the melt bit, then it's a little easier to understand their other devices and focus on them. So in terms of walkthrough, overall, we've got the ability to resize. I think they said that's 4 times the size. So obviously going to be too tiny on 4K to okay on 4K or 8K or whatever. Technically, it probably could go a little bit larger, especially seeing that all seems to be SVG or whatever is used in these situations. It doesn't seem to get goopy or anything like that. But that's all cool. We're probably not in the situation where that many people are working on 8 or 16K screens, so that's all fine. There are some things where alignment here is fine here and then not here and then a little all over here. but it's a tiny developer, and it makes little difference in the bigger scheme of things. It may even be deliberate because, to be perfectly blunt, when you had devices like cheaper computers or cheaper computer games and stuff, you often got this kind of all over the place sort of thing in that period in the 80s. The lean towards, VIC-20s and what have you is a little bit obvious, but that's their target market. We have, as we saw, some patches. In terms of saving your own, not really that hard. You just go save and you can create a new one or save over. I've created my new one and it seems to come back. You can't set your overall size to be there all the time. Next time you open one of these from scratch, it will tend to be back to small, unless, of course, you set it to this size, save your patch with it this size, and then it will come back. Once you save them inside a project, then they stay the same size. So it's not like they always reset. Some devices just always reset, which is super annoying. These ones just have a little bit more of a rule set. So I assume that they don't assign anything to prefs. They just save it into their patch or their state. Fair enough. And we've already seen the random button, which just randomizes these. Whether there's any kind of weighting or logic in that, don't know. It does randomize, but in this case, as I said, you are more likely to get interesting results. They can tend to be a little over the top. So back to the initialize. We'll work through the order in which this works. We've got the input, which in many ways you could probably just leave alone. There are no meters on here, so there's no indication to say that you have to run it at a certain kind of level, which is good because I'm going to run it at the level that I want to run it at. That's what gain staging is. It's like I set it to what I want it to be. It seems to run hot. But that's the whole idea, to get people into distorty territory as fast as possible. There's no way to decrease the input, so they are very much working on saying, you obviously want to run this hot, so we can add another 12 dB on the front end. As I said, everything in this is prone to, like all the knobs are prone to running hot, so to speak. We've got an EQ here, which is preset, plus minus. The plus and the minus don't actually match each other. So I'd say they're fairly broad curves. Double clicking will reset them. Double clicking on these means that you can type a value in. Cool. Let's just kill everything so we're only listening to the one thing at a time. So the EQ it's a broad tone. You're not really going to use this as a full-on EQ. But if you're wanting to finesse the tone to have more of this, less of that or whatever, then it does work nicely. There's also a low cut, which is just a high-pass filter. Again, I don't recall them telling us where it's set or what its roll-off is or anything like that. But using my F2 window, there's quite a marked roll-off. So it's pretty cool. I'm more than happy with how that behaves. A lot of the patches have the low cut on. It will help us to cut the mix a lot better, but it can sometimes seem a little thin, but not in a bad way. It's so, just be aware of this, that they've got this sort of thing where they turn it on and off. Again, your text does kind of run into the edges of the the box in which it's the button is in, and they don't feel very buttony. They almost feel like they operate backwards. But it's all there and it all works. We've then got the saturation, which is incredibly poorly explained and honestly very obtuse. I would like to understand how it works better, so I feel like I can actually choose to control it rather than use it somewhat randomly. The explanation probably makes sense to the dev, but the dev hasn't thought that maybe people outside of his brain have to try to understand it themselves. Some pictures, some sense of what's really going on, because it's sort of like it all seems incredibly circular. So you've got your saturation level, which at one stage they seem to suggest is a wet-dry mix. I don't understand, but it can get grindy very, very quickly. Gain is supposed to be a trim for anything that we've lost, but it's set to a... I don't understand it. I guess we have lost some here, but it's incredibly minor. And some knobs and buttons really only function properly when something else has a value that isn't 0. Again, odd and obtuse. That's not to say that it's wrong, it's characterful, but it would just be a lot nicer to be able to really understand it. So I would love to be able to be doing the review where I say this is exactly what's going on here, to become kind of like the alternate RTFM, only with a face. But I can't, because the manual itself is unhelpful. It does not stop you from using it, but it does provide some frustration when you're trying to create very fine alterations. Because again, this just goes heavy-handed. It's like, oh yes, the first little waggle of the button, you're at 11. And by the time you're there, you're at 4,000. And it's like, yeah, okay, great when we want to go crazy, but if we don't want to go crazy. So you've got your saturation level. We can hear something's happening there. And you can actually hear intermodulation distortion happening here. And that's not bad. This is the nature of distortion, but it is distortion more than saturation. And it's got this shape. The shape is not explained at all, so I have no idea what this is really doing. This seems to indicate almost that it was a 50 to 100% mix. Now, I never mix my my saturation with my non-saturation, because as far as I'm concerned, if you plug something into a neve, it's 100% neved. You don't plug it into a neve and to your SSL and to your perfectly clean audio interface to Reaper or whatever. You plug it into a neve and you pull the sound out the other end, in which case that sound is 100% neved. Different people see it different ways and want wet dries. I see a wet dry here. But I don't know whether that's changing the transfer curve, like going from a sine wave to something a little more exciting. It's just very hard to feel what's happening here. And very easy, therefore, to actually create something that seems fine, but then once you get into practical use, it's just overdone. So there's a saturation section. I wish I could tell you exactly what it was doing. We then have this low-pass filter damper, which is actually really good. It seems kind of mild, and it's got an interesting curve to it. I have no idea what it is. I'd be interested to know what they've done here. Is this quite aggressive, but somehow comes off as mild? It's really nice. So we can run this thing pretty hot and hard. And then back that off. So if nothing else, just turning this down a little bit tends to take off that, especially in Reason, that perfect everything going right up there. It warms it up a lot, and that is really nice. So even with all this treble happening, get a warmer sound. It's a little crunchy. Okay, now we get to the heart of things, but this is pretty important because that sets up a lot of how this feels and how it interacts here. So we've now got the melt section, which is based around tape logic. But it's really poor quality tape logic in the sense that I'm not doubting their logic. I'm just saying that their tape is poor quality because that's what people are looking for, that really nasty $2 VCR tape that you bought, the VHS tape, for a machine that's never had its heads cleaned since 1982. It's about creating this. Nothing was that nasty. Actually, as an aside, one of the girls is doing Virgin Suicides, the Sofia Coppola movie, in her advanced English thingy class, and so we watched it yesterday. And at one stage, they put on a record at a party because this is supposed to be 1975, and somebody had altered the record to make it sound like it was all. And it was just like, oh my, this is not how the 70s and 80s actually sounded. It's a delusion. Yes, you would get this nasty effect if you bought really, really, really terrible VHS cassettes. So we've got wow, which is set by the mod speed. So where tape actually does tend to have pretty well-defined wow and flutter speeds, this allows you to alter them, which is good because the amount that this piles on, you are going to need to tune it to the movement of your piece. Otherwise, if you've got this moving at this and your drum's moving at that, and it's just... It is good that this is not BPM synced, but you just got to have something so that it flows and grooves rather than just breaks and makes people want to vomit. So you can add the wow, which is the slower movement. Then you can add flutter, which is... I think they said 4 times or 2 times or 4 times whatever this base rate is. So whatever you've said here, this is 2 or 4 times. It was in the RTFM. That they were clear about. Thank you. I just forgot what the number was. But they are related to each other. My understanding was that flutter was generally about 3. So if that's the case, 1.5, 0.75... Now, there is some kind of going on up there. So I don't know whether that's flutter. Kind of sounds like it. There's a kind of thing, which is an incredibly fast vibration. As I say, I think it's somewhere around 3K. So my maths is roughly right, then that's sort of right. But it's also got some other kind of movement going on in there. So if we have... So true flutter on cassette is a little like that funny computery sound that you get in a poor quality MP3, where you get this crystalline graininess up top. Flutter is actually a little like that. Then we've got dropout. It just quite literally uses this speed to tremolo. But wait, kiddies, we've got more. There is a random knob. So we've got what sounds like a sine wave, and then the ability to dial in randomness. So as you can hear, it's now all really drunk. Flat. Moving. That is really nice. I think it's massively overdone, in which case we look at, well, how do we make this more subtle? We can spend our time turning these down, but I often find that even in these sorts of amounts here, a tape deck with 6% wow or flutter, that's for the bin. It really is useless. It was small amounts, generally under 1%. Shift doesn't do anything. Control does, again, which is odd and breaks convention, because commonly you use Control click to reset things, and you use Shift to make them more sensitive. But this is Control to make them more sensitive. So it's just one of those things that's a little annoying, and because I'll sort of say the more truly useful settings are right down in here, then I would love for there to be some way to make this a lot easier to access the tiny amounts. Again, I think overall, having used the device, rather than making sort of redefining the top end of how far these throw to, either you change the shape of the way the knob works, the transfer, rather than being straight or whatever, you make it so that the first bit of the knob is really, really not doing much at all, and then suddenly goes whoop right out into crazy town. But as I say, I think it might be nice to simply make a negative operation of the Mondo button, which we'll get to later. Knob. So we've got these amounts, which you do have to really watch how you're using it, because it can sound fine in solo, and then you start playing it back and you come back later and you go, that's just too much. Now you can take all of these things and simply have them operating left and right. So as a chorus will commonly, like a mono chorus, the LFO is just doing this. A stereo chorus, it's doing the opposite, or some sort of not perfectly in sync with each other. So chorus takes all these settings and simply offsets them so that you ultimately at 100% get the blip, 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 complete opposite. I like that. It does make this an awful lot more noticeable, because wow and flutter and dropouts, well, dropouts can be stereo. They tend not to behave stereo. They're just like an actual hole in the audio at that point, but they tend not to be stereo, and your wow and flutter tends not to be stereo either. So it's a little bit of a faux one, but nonetheless, if you've got mild enough settings, then you can actually get really quite a nice chorusy sort of feel out of it. I like that. I like the fact that they've added that, because, well, quite honestly, it's the sort of thing that I would do. But just be aware that tape doesn't chorus that way. But in terms of an effect, that's quite nice. You have an ability to wet dry. Obviously, that immediately becomes a chorus, because we've got our dry signal doing nothing, our wet signal doing this. Put the two together, you've got a chorus. Use as you see, but really it should be at 100% if you are chasing tape. We can set our overall in-out. This will actually go right down to nothing. So if you've got nothing else in your chain and you've got this after your synth, you can use this as your turn the level down. That means that your relationship with the saturation and everything will stay exactly the same, and you'll just turn the level down like you were using the fader on your mixing desk. I often prefer to do that before it hits the mixing desk to give my final fader freedom to move things, because if you start automating faders early on or what have you, and then you change and you're just, oh, that's no good. Some DAWs are easier than others with that, but I will always tend to do my synth automations, my dynamics stuff. I want it to be quieter here and louder there at the device. Obviously, if we change the level of the device here, then we change our saturation relationship, our drive relationship. So this going to 0, you may sort of think, oh, but why does it go so far down? It's actually really useful that way. So it's actually a small but a nicely thought through thing, and then you can add another 12 dB on top of that. This Mondo knob, Mondo, world. I don't know what it means, but it is a global knob, which may be what they're just trying to let us know. Anything that's set at 0, nothing happens. Anything that has a setting, it gets multiplied by something. Again, the RTFM does not tell us, and it says that the more dramatic any setting is, the more dramatic the results of the Mondo thing will be. Not noticeably distorted. Oh. So it's taking everything that has any level that isn't 0 and multiplying it by a factor of something. I'm guessing it may be 10, because it's probably what I would do. It might be 5, but I would probably go 10, because if you're going to do it, let's go hell for leather. I'm not going to use that as a general rule. I know some people will. But again, because I've set something up and I sort of go, oh, yep, that sounds quite nice now. Come back later and go, oh, no, that's just much too much. But I like the relationship within that. So moving these around starts to change that. Being able to have that as a divide by would be just super. So honestly, guys, if you're watching this, which I hope you do, then turn one of these into a little button, or have a little button. You can change the state. You can even change the color. Make it like a loser color for people like me. Turn it blue, and then it allows the unit to be used very subtly. And then I could quite easily see it as my go-to instead of some tape and saturation things, because it has a real charm to it. And explain these a little better, even if you just want to send an email. Like if you send us a thing, or even just write it on the YouTube below, just sort of explain what this thing does. It's good information for people. Like, what does this really do? What is that relationship? Because honestly, the RTFM doesn't make sense. So that's everything that it does, and it's how you put it all together where it becomes magical. So again, if we start with our bland piece, everything's pretty flat. Applied a little bit of Hertz delay. Just add a little bit of depth of movement, but the difference is deliberately quite subtle. How that synth sound now becomes quite beautiful because it's got movement. Now those drums suddenly become a lot more interesting. Okay, they've got stereo on there, which is not a good plan. Hats up a little bit more, which is probably why they were so darn loud in the first place, because they assumed someone's going to do this, and we get a nice sounding piece. Flat, a lot of movement and depth. So the AB is where this really gets its value, but again, we just don't want to have everything have so dramatic an effect. which is just that these knobs tend to go far too far. They are probably really, really great for that drunken sort of thing, the retro blaze where everything's like, David Hasselhoff has eaten too much neon. But in terms of being able to be used more seriously, like on a rock record or a country record or something like that, which is where, that being able to plug into your mythical Neve and have the sounds really is just wonderful. Or my own personal music, where I want a lot of movement, but I generally want the movement to be subtle so that it just sounds beautiful. Let's say, for example, go listen to my stuff, but for example, let's say Roxy Music's Avalon. The Jupiter 8s in there just sound like enormous, and that's going to be a combination of, Jupiter 8, of the whatever chorus type units they've used, the desk, which could be a Neve, could be an SSL, I'm not really sure. I think it's going to be a Neve. So it's just got all this saturation, all this movement gone onto tape, so that the multi-track tape, which would have had very little movement, and then of course the 2-inch master. Nonetheless, those Jupiter 8 synth sounds inside Roxy Music's Avalon are just so beautiful, while seeming perfectly, linear, and there isn't that sense of them being. That's what I would love to do with this more than anything else, and it will do it. Just means being an awful lot more subtle with the controls. But the core of saying we're going to build a device that acts like that sort of modern idea of tape and the fantasy around, or a romanticizing, probably more accurately, around VHS degradation. It does it really, really well, just perhaps overdoes it a little bit for people like myself. But if you are looking for that whole, let's make my piece do this, then this does it wonderfully. To put it onto the masters or something like that, I haven't tried, but it just needs the ability to be toned right back so that we can have it be very, very subtle. To give you a sense of a comparison, let's grab something of my own, this fella here. So we'll turn off the Mondo and off this guy. That's MondoMelt at the point that we had it. And this is looser. Yeah, how much more subtle that movement is. You may well say it's not moving at all, Benedict. Good, because I don't want you to be consciously going, oh, look, that's... But in a mix, that comes out really, really nicely. And in my own mixes, I combine this with Hornet analog stage tube. So we've got that little bit of movement, the wow and flutter type thing, and a very light tube saturation. So the ability to work more in that arena would really, really change this from being a wacky sideline thing to a thing that I would probably use all the time. And that, I think, also opens you up to a broader audience without having to reduce what you do. Yeah, that's it. I do like the device, and I've enjoyed using it so far, and I'm starting to spend some time now with the Echo Melt, which has this, actually with some more functionality inside it, as well as an Echo, and everyone who knows me knows that Benedict loves Echo. So we'll focus on that. And I'm actually using it in a piece at the moment to see how it goes, sort of in creative, in battle. And I'm expecting to be overall fairly happy, but I'm also expecting to have the same complaints because this is built around that mindset. All right, most important thing is get out there, have a play with these. If this is a sort of direction or a thing that you're looking for, there's a lot to offer in here. If you're looking for that, just make everything like really... then it's absolutely aces for that. But if you are looking for the really subtle sort of thing, then you may just need to learn to use these very cautiously. Get out there, have fun, you have a great day.